Imagine waking up one morning and your entire world is gone. Not destroyed, not burned, not conquered, just underwater. Your home, your village. The forests where your grandfather taught you to hunt, the rivers where your children played, all of it swallowed by a rising sea, slowly, silently over generations. This isn't a myth. This isn't a movie plot. This actually happened, somewhere beneath the cold gray waters of the North Sea. Between what we now call Britain and the Netherlands, there lies a drowned world. A place that was once home to thousands of people. A land with rivers, hills, valleys, and wildlife. A place where humans lived, loved, hunted, and died, and then one day the sea took it all. Archaeologists call it Doggerland, and the deeper scientists dig, or rather dive, into its secrets, the more extraordinary the story becomes. Because this wasn't a small patch of swamp. We're talking about a landmass, the size of a modern country. A world that existed for thousands of years before. It vanished beneath the waves around 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. And here's the thing that makes it even more haunting. We have almost no idea what was truly lost. No written records. No monuments left standing, just fragments, bones, tools, traces of lives buried under 40 meters of seawater. So today we're going to dive in, literally and figuratively, into one of the most fascinating lost worlds in all of human history. Welcome to Doggerland, the lost world beneath the North Sea. Close your eyes for a second and imagine standing on a wide, open plain. The air is crisp, the sky is huge. Around you, tall grasses sway in the wind, and in the distance you can hear the sound of a river, slow, steady, winding its way through a valley thick with trees. A herd of mammoths crosses the horizon. Wolves pace at the edge of the tree line. A flock of birds rises from a wetland nearby, their calls echoing across the open land. This isn't Africa. This isn't some prehistoric jungle you've only seen in documentaries. This is Europe, right here, right where the North Sea sits today. And it was real. Around 10,000 to 20,000 years ago, during and just after the last ice age, so much of the world's water was locked up in massive glaciers that sea levels were dramatically lower than they are today. And that meant land that is now deep underwater was back then completely dry. Between what we now call Britain and mainland Europe, where today there's nothing but open gray sea, there was an enormous stretch of land. Geographers and archaeologists have named it Doggerland, after the Dogger Bank, a shallow sandbank in the North Sea where fishing trawlers have been accidentally pulling up ancient bones and tools for over a century. At its largest, Doggerland was massive. We're not talking about a small strip of coastline. This was a landmass potentially the size of a modern European country. Some estimates compare it to the size of Great Britain itself. It had everything a thriving landscape could offer. There were hills and valleys. There were wide, slow-moving rivers. Ancient versions of what we now call the Thames and the Rhine actually joined together and flowed through Doggerland as one great river system before emptying into the sea far to the north. There were vast wetlands, rich with fish and waterfowl. There were dense forests of birch, pine, and willow, providing shelter and fuel. And the wildlife? Extraordinary. Woolly mammoths roamed its plains in the earlier periods. Cave lions and brown bears hunted through its forests. Aurochs, massive wild cattle, the ancestors of today's domesticated cows, grazed across its grasslands. Red deer, wild boar, beavers, otters. Doggerland was, by any measure, a land absolutely teeming with life. In fact, many scientists now believe that Doggerland wasn't just habitable. It was arguably one of the richest environments in all of prehistoric northwestern Europe. The combination of rivers, wetlands, forest, and open plain meant that food was available in abundance in almost every season. This was not a wasteland. This was not some barren, forgotten corner of the world. This was a paradise, a heartland, and people knew it. Now, you might be wondering, if this place has been underwater for thousands of years, how do we actually know any of this? That's a fair question. And honestly, the answer is one of the most fascinating parts of the whole story. It starts, surprisingly, with fishermen. For generations, trawler fishermen working the waters of the North Sea would occasionally haul up something unexpected in their nets. Not fish, not seaweed, but bones. Big ones, strange ones. Bones of animals that had no business being at the bottom of the sea, mammoth tusks, the skulls of ancient lions, the teeth of woolly rhinoceroses. At first, many of these finds were treated as curiosities. Interesting, sure, but not fully understood. It wasn't until the 20th century that scientists began to put the pieces together and realize what they were actually looking at. Fragments of a lost world, preserved in the cold, low-oxygen sediment of the seafloor. Then, in 1931, something remarkable happened. A fishing trawler called the Kalinda was working an area called the Lehman and Ower Banks when it pulled up a lump of peat from the seafloor. Inside that peat was a beautifully crafted antler harpoon, clearly made by human hands. Decorated, deliberate, ancient, this was not an animal bone, this was a tool. Proof that people had once stood on that spot, dry land beneath their feet, making weapons to hunt with. It changed everything. Since then, the scientific tools used to study Doggerland have become increasingly sophisticated. One of the biggest breakthroughs has come from seismic survey data, originally collected by oil and gas companies mapping the seafloor for commercial purposes. Scientists realized that this data could be repurposed to create detailed three-dimensional maps of the ancient landscape buried beneath the seabed. Suddenly, they could see the old riverbeds, the hills, the coastlines, all of it, frozen in time under layers of sediment and water. Then there's palynology, the study of ancient pollen. Samples taken from the seafloor sediments have revealed exactly what kinds of plants were growing in Doggerland at different points in time. This is how we know about the birch forests, the wetland reeds, the grassland flowers. Every grain of ancient pollen is like a tiny time capsule. DNA analysis of animal and human remains has added another layer. And underwater archaeological excavations, though incredibly difficult and expensive, have begun recovering artifacts directly from the seafloor. Piece by piece, a world that had been invisible for thousands of years is coming back into focus. And the more clearly we can see it, the more incredible it becomes. So we know the land existed. We know it was rich and alive. But who were the people who actually lived there? They were what archaeologists call Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, people of the Middle Stone Age, living in the period roughly between 10,000 and 6,000 years ago. And before you picture primitive cave dwellers, let me stop you right there. These were not simple people. They were intelligent, adaptable, resourceful human beings, fully modern Homo sapiens, just like you and me, who had developed sophisticated skills for surviving and thriving in their environment. They knew their landscape intimately. They understood the seasons, the animal migrations, the river flood cycles. They had tools crafted with real precision: flint blades, bone needles, wooden spears, woven baskets. They lived in small mobile groups moving across the landscape to follow food sources. In summer, they might head to the upland forests to hunt deer. In winter, they'd move toward the coast or the rivers, where fish and shellfish provided a reliable food source. The wetlands of Doggerland, in particular, were like a giant natural supermarket. Fish, eels, waterfowl, plant roots, berries, available year-round if you knew where to look. They almost certainly had language. Storytelling, music, and ritual. We know from other Mesolithic sites across Europe that these communities buried their dead with care, sometimes with grave goods, objects placed alongside the body, suggesting belief in something beyond death. They painted, carved, and decorated objects. They had relationships, communities, identities. They were, in every meaningful sense of the word, people, with lives as full and complex as our own. And Doggerland was not just their hunting ground, it was their home. The land their parents had been born on, the land their grandparents had walked. The rivers they'd played beside as children, the hills they'd climbed to watch the sunrise. It was theirs, all of it, until, slowly, and then all at once, it wasn't. Every great story has a turning point, a moment where things begin to shift, where the world that once felt permanent and solid starts to show its first cracks. For the people of Doggerland, that turning point wasn't a war. It wasn't a plague, it wasn't an invasion, it was the sun. Around 12,000 years ago, the Earth's climate began to warm. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly. The massive glaciers that had covered large parts of the northern hemisphere for tens of thousands of years started to melt. And as they melted, all that frozen water had to go somewhere. It went into the oceans. Now, this wasn't a sudden flood. This wasn't a disaster movie where a wall of water comes crashing over the horizon. This was something far more unsettling in its own quiet way, a gradual rise, year after year. Generation after generation, the sea crept forward, slowly, steadily, like a tide that never fully went back out. Scientists estimate that during this period, sea levels around Doggerland were rising at an average of perhaps a few millimeters per year. That doesn't sound like much, does it? A few millimeters? You wouldn't even notice it in a single lifetime. But here's the thing about flat, low-lying land. Even a small rise in sea level can swallow enormous amounts of territory. A rise of just a meter or two across a wide, gently sloping plain can push the coastline back by kilometers, and Doggerland, with its vast wetlands and river valleys, was exactly that kind of terrain. So what happened was this. The edges began to go first, the lowest-lying coastal areas, the marshes closest to the sea, the river mouths and estuaries, these started to flood. The salt water pushed in. The freshwater wetlands that communities had depended on for generations became brackish, then fully marine. The forests at the edges began to die, their roots drowned by salt water. The shoreline moved inland, and the people moved with it. This is one of the most important things to understand about this story. For most of Doggerland's decline, this was not a catastrophe that killed people outright. It was a slow squeeze, a gradual compression of the world they knew. Communities that had once ranged freely across a vast landscape found their territory shrinking. Hunting grounds that had fed families for generations disappeared beneath the water. Sacred places, rivers, hills, gathering spots were swallowed one by one. The mental map that a Doggerland hunter carried in their head, learned over a lifetime, passed down from their parents and grandparents, slowly became outdated, unreliable, wrong. Imagine being told that the forest where your grandfather taught you to track deer is now underwater, that the river where you were married no longer exists, that the hill where your community gathered every summer to trade and celebrate is gone, just gone beneath gray water. That is what the people of Doggerland lived through. Not once, but across dozens of generations. A world slowly, relentlessly disappearing beneath their feet. By around 8,000 years ago, what had once been a vast, connected landmass had been significantly reduced. Britain had already become an island, separated from mainland Europe by rising waters. Doggerland itself had shrunk dramatically, reduced to what scientists believe may have been a large island or series of islands in the southern North Sea, still inhabited, still lived on, but a shadow of what it once was. A wounded world, still breathing, but only just. So what was life actually like for the last people of Doggerland? We can't know for certain. They left no written records, no monuments, no temples that survived the waves. But by combining what we know from archaeology, climate science, and studies of other Mesolithic communities, we can paint a picture, and it's one that is equal parts resilient and heartbreaking. By the time Doggerland had shrunk to its final remnants, perhaps around 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, the communities living there would have been facing increasing pressure from all sides. Literally. The land was smaller. That meant fewer resources stretched across more competing groups. The rich, diverse ecosystem that had once made Doggerland such a paradise was becoming fragmented. The great river systems that had provided fish in abundance were narrowing, changing, some disappearing entirely. The forests that had provided timber, shelter, and game were retreating to higher ground. And yet people stayed. This is something that might surprise us, but it really shouldn't. Because human beings don't abandon their homes easily, even when conditions deteriorate, even when the rational choice might seem obvious to an outsider. We are creatures of place, of belonging, of memory. The last Doglanders, if we can call them that, were likely people who had known no other home, whose entire identity, whose entire understanding of the world was rooted in that particular stretch of land. The idea of leaving, of crossing the water to the strange shores of what is now Britain or the Netherlands, must have felt deeply alien, deeply wrong. So they adapted. They fished more as the land shrank and hunting became harder. They became more maritime, building better boats, learning the tidal patterns, harvesting the sea's resources with increasing sophistication. Coastal and island-dwelling Mesolithic communities across northern Europe showed exactly this kind of adaptation, and the last Doglanders were almost certainly no different. But adaptation has its limits. There are only so many fish in the sea, only so much land left to stand on, Only so many times a community can watch the water creep closer to their doorstep before the question is no longer whether to leave, but when. And then, before that question could even be fully answered, something happened. Something sudden. Something terrifying. Something that may have ended Doggerland not with a slow sigh, but with a roar. It's around 6,200 BCE, a quiet morning on what remains of Doggerland. The sea is calm, the sky is pale, somewhere a fire is burning at the edge of a small settlement. Children are awake, fishermen are preparing their boats, and then far out to the northwest, far beneath the surface of the ocean, off the coast of what is now Norway, the seafloor moves. Not a little, not a tremor, but a catastrophic underwater landslide stretching for hundreds of kilometers. An estimated 3,000 cubic kilometers of sediment breaks free from the continental shelf and slides into the deep ocean. It is one of the largest underwater landslides in recorded geological history, and it generates a tsunami. This event is real. It is documented. Scientists call it the Storegga Slide, and the evidence for the tsunami it produced has been found at sites all around the North Sea coastline, in Scotland, in Norway, in the Faroe Islands, as layers of sand deposited far inland, well above the normal high tide mark. Sand that had no business being there, sand that was carried by a wave. Researchers estimate that the tsunami it generated could have produced waves of between 10 and 20 meters high as they hit the coastlines of the North Sea. Some estimates suggest even higher in certain locations. Now think about what that means for Doggerland. By this point, whatever remained of Doggerland was already low-lying, flat, barely above sea level in many places. The kind of land that a 10-meter wave doesn't just flood, it erases. The timing fits, the geology fits, and the sheer scale of the event fits the magnitude of what happened to Doggerland. Many scientists now believe that while the slow sea level rise had been eating away at Doggerland for thousands of years, it may have been the Storegga tsunami that delivered the killing blow, the final catastrophic event that swallowed the last remnants of this lost world beneath the waves. In a single morning, everything that remained, the settlements, the fishing camps, the pathways between communities, the last sacred places of a people who had lived there for thousands of years, could have been swept away, and the people, some perhaps survived, those who were on higher ground. Those who were lucky enough to be facing the right direction, who saw the water pulling back before the wave arrived, a classic warning sign, and ran. Those survivors would have made it to the shores of Britain or the coast of what is now the Netherlands, traumatized, displaced, refugees from a world that no longer existed, carrying with them memories of a land that was already disappearing, a land that after that morning was simply gone. Doggerland didn't just sink quietly into history, it was taken. The sea keeps its secrets well, but not forever. For thousands of years, Doggerland lay silent beneath the North Sea, undisturbed, unremembered, unknown. The people who had once walked its plains and fished its rivers were long gone. The civilizations that rose and fell across Europe had no memory of it. Even the idea that an entire world could exist beneath those cold gray waters seemed, for most of human history, simply unthinkable. And then the fishermen started pulling up bones. We touched on this briefly in Chapter 1, the trawlers, the unexpected hauls, the mammoth tusks, and ancient teeth dragged up in fishing nets. But let's slow down here and really appreciate what some of these discoveries mean, because a few of them are genuinely extraordinary. Take the Lehman and Ower antler harpoon, the one pulled up by the trawler Kalinda back in 1931, embedded inside a lump of ancient peat. This wasn't just any object. It was a beautifully crafted barbed point made from red deer antler, designed with real skill and intention. When scientists examined it, they determined it was around 11,000 years old. 11,000 years. And it had been sitting at the bottom of the North Sea, perfectly preserved in that block of peat waiting to be found. That harpoon is now in the Norwich Castle Museum in England, and every time someone looks at it, they are looking at an object that was last held by human hands in a world that no longer exists. Then there are the human remains. Perhaps the most haunting discovery came in 2009 when a fragment of a human skull was recovered from the seafloor of the North Sea. Analysis revealed it belonged to a person who had lived approximately 10,000 years ago, right in the heart of Doggerland's inhabited period. This wasn't an accidental drowning victim. This was someone who had lived and died on dry land, whose remains had been preserved by the cold, sediment-rich seafloor for 10 millennia. Who were they? A hunter? A mother? A community elder? We will never know. But that fragment of bone is a direct, physical connection to a human being who walked the lost world beneath our feet. Animal remains have also been recovered in remarkable quantities. Bones of woolly mammoths, cave lions, woolly rhinoceroses, giant deer, animals that paint a vivid picture of the rich, diverse ecosystem that once thrived across Doggerland's landscape. Some of these bones show clear evidence of human activity, cut marks from stone tools, signs of butchering. People hunted these animals, ate them, used their bones and skins. And beyond bones and tools, there is something perhaps even more evocative: ancient peat and wood, chunks of Doggerland's old forests, preserved on the seafloor, tree stumps still rooted in their original soil, pollen locked inside ancient sediment, telling us what flowers bloomed and what trees grew in a world that vanished thousands of years ago. Each of these finds is a whisper from a lost world, a message in a bottle sent across 10,000 years of silence, and we are only just beginning to hear what they have to say. Here is something remarkable to consider. We have been seriously studying Doggerland for less than 30 years. Given that this was an inhabited landmass the size of a country, that timeline is astonishing. We know more about the surface of Mars than we do about what lies beneath the North Sea. But that is changing, and fast. The real revolution in Doggerland research began when scientists started getting access to seismic survey data collected by oil and gas companies. These companies had spent decades mapping the geology beneath the North Sea in extraordinary detail, looking for oil deposits. What they produced almost as a byproduct were incredibly detailed three-dimensional maps of the ancient landscape buried beneath the seabed. For archaeologists, this was like being handed a treasure map. Suddenly, they could trace the courses of ancient rivers. They could identify where hills and valleys had once been. They could see clearly the outline of a world that had been invisible since the water swallowed it. Professor Vince Gaffney at the University of Bradford has been one of the leading figures in this work. His team essentially reconstructed Doggerland in digital form, giving us the most complete picture we have ever had of what this lost landscape actually looked like. And what they found confirmed something extraordinary. At its peak, Doggerland wasn't a marginal, edge-of-the-world kind of place. It was central. It sat at the heart of northwestern Europe. The great river systems that flowed through it connected distant regions. The rich hunting and fishing grounds it offered would have made it one of the most desirable places to live in the entire continent. Beyond seismic data, environmental DNA, or eDNA, is opening up entirely new possibilities. Scientists can now extract ancient genetic material directly from seafloor sediment samples and identify which species were present in a given location thousands of years ago. Plant species, animal species, even traces of human genetic material, all potentially recoverable from the mud at the bottom of the North Sea. Meanwhile, underwater archaeological excavations are becoming more feasible, though they remain extraordinarily challenging. Diving in the North Sea is no easy task. Poor visibility, strong currents, cold temperatures, but specialist teams have been developing new techniques for carefully excavating seafloor sites, recovering fragile artifacts without destroying the context they sit in. There are also exciting developments in drone and remotely operated vehicle technology, underwater robots that can survey large areas of the seafloor in detail, building photographic and geometric maps of what lies below without the need for human divers at all. And citizen science is playing a role too. Fishermen across the North Sea have been encouraged to report and preserve any unusual finds they bring up in their nets, turning an industry that once accidentally destroyed archaeological material into an unexpected partner in discovery. The picture is becoming clearer every year, every season, every research expedition. And every time it does, the lost world of Doggerland becomes a little less lost. Let's step back for a moment, because this story, as fascinating as it is on a purely historical and archaeological level, is about something much bigger than the past. It is about right now. We live in an era of rising sea levels. That is not a political statement. That is a geological and scientific fact, supported by decades of careful measurement and research. The world's oceans are rising, driven by melting glaciers and ice sheets and the thermal expansion of warming ocean water, at a rate that is accelerating year by year. And the story of Doggerland tells us, with haunting clarity, what rising seas actually mean for human beings. It's easy to look at a graph of sea level projections and feel disconnected from the numbers. half a meter, 1 meter, 2 meters by 2,100. These are abstractions. They don't feel real in the way that a mammoth bone or an antler harpoon feels real, but Doggerland makes it real. Because Doggerland tells us that sea level rise doesn't just flood land. It destroys worlds. It erases the places where people build their identities, their communities, their memories. It takes the rivers where children play, and the hills where grandparents are buried, and the forests that have fed families for generations, and it puts them underwater forever. Today, millions of people around the world live in low-lying coastal areas that are increasingly at risk. Entire island nations in the Pacific are watching their land disappear. Communities in Bangladesh, in the Netherlands, in Florida, in parts of Southeast Asia, all facing a version of the same slow squeeze that the people of Doggerland experienced 8,000 years ago. And just like the Doglanders, many of these communities are not running. They are adapting, holding on, refusing to leave the only home they have ever known. There is something else Doggerland teaches us too, about memory, and about what gets lost when a world disappears. The people who fled Doggerland, whether driven out by the slow rise of the sea or by the catastrophic Storegga Tsunami, carried their memories with them. But memories fade. Stories become vaguer with each generation. Within a few hundred years, the grandchildren of Doggerland's refugees probably had only the haziest sense that their ancestors had come from somewhere out there, beneath the water. And within 1,000 years, nothing. The world their great-great-grandparents had loved was completely forgotten. Is it possible, just possible, that distant echoes of Doggerland's loss survived in the myths and legends of the peoples who descended from its refugees? Some researchers have suggested that ancient flood myths found in cultures across the world may carry genuine memories of real catastrophic sea level events from the end of the last ice age. It's a tantalizing idea, impossible to prove, but impossible to entirely dismiss. What we do know is this: Doggerland was real. Its people were real. Their lives, their communities, their love for their land, all of it was real. And the sea took it. Slowly and then all at once, it is the oldest story of climate change we have. And it is buried right now, just beneath the surface of a sea that millions of people cross every year without ever knowing what lies below. A lost world, waiting to be remembered. So here we are, at the end of a journey that took us back 10,000 years to a world that most people have never heard of, walking land that no longer exists, alongside people whose names we will never know. And yet somehow it doesn't feel distant, does it? Because that's the thing about Doggerland. The more you learn about it, the more it stops feeling like ancient history and starts feeling like something else entirely. Something closer. Something personal. Think about what we've covered today. We started by standing on the open plains of a lost world, a landscape rich with rivers, forests, wildlife, and life. A place that was, by every measure, one of the finest places to be a human being in all of prehistoric Europe. We met the people who called it home, not primitive cave dwellers, but intelligent, resourceful, deeply human communities who knew their world intimately and loved it completely. Then we watched it disappear. Slowly at first, the sea creeping in at the edges, generation after generation, swallowing the low-lying marshes and river mouths, pushing the shoreline further and further inland. We imagined what it must have felt like to watch your world shrink, to tell your children about forests that are now underwater, to mourn places that only exist in memory. And then we felt the shockwave of the Storegga Tsunami, that single catastrophic mourning that may have ended it all. That roar from the deep that swallowed whatever remained of Doggerland in one terrible surge of water, and then we came back to the surface. We looked at the bones and tools and fragments that patient scientists have been pulling from the seafloor piece by piece, year by year, and we watched a lost world slowly come back into focus. Not fully, not completely, but enough to see its outline, enough to feel its presence, enough to remember it. And maybe that's the most important thing of all. Remembering. Because Doggerland didn't just vanish, it was forgotten. For thousands of years, an entire world, an entire chapter of human experience, lay buried and unknown beneath the North Sea, as though it had never existed at all. And there's something quietly devastating about that. How many Doglanders sat around fires in the evenings and told stories? How many of them watched their children take their first steps on that now drowned land? How many of them looked out across those wide open plains and felt the particular kind of deep peace that comes from being exactly where you belong, We'll never know, but we know they were there. And now, thanks to the tireless work of scientists, archaeologists, and researchers, and thanks to the accidental preservation of the cold, dark seafloor, we are finally beginning to give them back. Their story. That matters. It matters because every human life matters, every community, every world that people built and loved and lost. And it matters because Doggerland is not just a story about the past, it is a story about us, about the world we are living in right now, about the coastlines that are already changing, about the communities already being displaced, about the places that future generations might one day study the way we study Doggerland, with wonder and with grief and with the quiet realization that we could have done more. The sea rose then. It is rising now. The only question is, what do we do with that knowledge? The people of Doggerland didn't have the science we have. They didn't have the data, the satellites, the climate models, the centuries of accumulated human knowledge that we carry with us today. They couldn't see what was coming clearly enough to change it. We can. So the next time you look out across the North Sea, or any sea, any ocean, any stretch of open water, take a moment. Think about what might lie beneath. Think about the worlds that have already been lost, the people who loved them, the lives that were lived on land that is now ocean floor, and think about the worlds that are still here, still standing, still breathing, still worth fighting for. Because if Doggerland teaches us anything across 10,000 years of silence, it's this: home is not forever, but memory is. If this story moved you, if it made you see the world a little differently, or think about history in a way you never quite have before, then I'd love to know. Drop a comment below and tell me what part of Doggerland's story hit you the hardest. Was it the people, the tsunami, the artifacts being pulled from the seafloor, or that bigger question about what we stand to lose today? I read every single comment. Every one. And if you're the kind of person who loves diving deep into the hidden, forgotten, extraordinary corners of human history, then honestly, you're exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, because we've got more lost worlds, forgotten civilizations, and untold stories coming, and you do not want to miss them. The past is stranger and richer and more heartbreaking than most of us were ever taught. Let's explore it together.